morning, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple of seconds here with the Retail Cities Top 100 retail preview. All right. Well, seems like it's as good a time as any to start talking about the U.S. retail landscape. So, hey, everybody. First of all, thanks to everyone for joining in this morning. My name is Brian Gildenberg, and for those of you I don't know, I am the Managing Director for North America for Retail Cities, the global retail research and insights business, founded by my good friend, former colleague, and now boss, Ray Gall, who's on the line joining us from Europe. At Retail Cities, our goal and mission is a simple one, which is basically to help you predict, map, and capture the next $10 trillion in global retail growth around the world. And today we're going to do that by focusing in on the projected $3 trillion of growth that's going to come from the US between now and the end of the decade. That 10 trillion number is basically the growth rate in retail around the world between now and 2030. At Retail Cities, our belief is a fundamental one, that when you look at the marketplace today, particularly in some of the larger, what are quote unquote referred to as mature markets of the world, that optimization is the order of the day, and cost management and chaos and uncertainty. And we've all got to just hunker down and try to manage the business. And we're going to generate cash and we're going to grow somewhere. And our belief is that growth is more of a mindset than a market by market issue, and that there are growth pockets in a variety of places that are unexpected. Today, as part of the look at our top 100, we're going to use that top 100 to illustrate what we believe are some of the most important growth pockets in the US marketplace for people looking to capitalize on this market to grow. And in some of the commentary that you'll hear today as we talk about this, in some respects, when you look at the construction of the US retail market, it's sometimes helpful to put a frame on it that looks more like the frame you would use from an emerging market point of view, and not a quote unquote mature or developed market point of view. At Retail Cities, we seek to be fact-based, and you'll see some of that today, as our top 100 list is a robust one, spanning a multitude of areas focused not just on retail, but really on the capture of consumer discretionary spend. So as a result, we broaden this out to look at both retail and food service, and both physical and digital retail as a way to capture that. Our perspective is global, so you'll hear a lot of references back and forth today to markets around the world. The US is a complicated place and unique in its own ways. And as a result, sometimes it's hard to bring global learnings to this market, not just because Americans are insular and don't like learning stuff from the rest of the world, though that's part of it. There's also some reasons. The structure of the US market's quite different than a number of the markets that you're trying to import best practices from. And as a result, sometimes those best practices don't work very well. Well, at Retail Cities, you'll find in our research an ongoing conversation about how to look at the rest of the world in a way in which best practices can be interpreted and extrapolated back to this market in a useful way. Try to be practical through both our research and our network of experts around the world. We're more aligned to helping you solve hands-on sort of today problems, and we are really forecasting the broad-based future. We'll try to be a little bit provocative, and you'll hear some of that today, I hope. So if you look at, and just a couple of seconds on Retail Cities, because I know some of you are less familiar with some of the stuff that we do. Basically, when you look at sort of how we bring content to the marketplace right now, in addition to on-site presentations and an in-person event that we're pulling together later this fall. Some of you may have been to our in-person events over the last year or so. We've had a couple mostly on the retail media space, and I think in the fall we'll be cycling some of our looks at retail media, as well as sort of an overall what we'll call a growth map for the US. And we'll take a look at some of that. As part of that growth map exercise, we do have a series of virtual workshops that help you understand and capture the next $3 trillion of growth in the US. This is one of them, obviously, but there will be 5 others throughout the course of the year that you and your organization can subscribe to. We do have a monthly series of insights that come out on a range of topics that you're going to see contained within this messaging today, within this messaging and communication today. And we also have our what we call the Next 10 Trillion video series, which is what I like to call the curriculum for growth, for global growth. So the webinars are really topical and sort of situation based and really helping you understand the marketplace. The webinars really tackle some of the big, broad sort of pillars of how businesses need to grow. That's some basic pricing for some of this. And if you're interested in a subscription to us, please let us know. As a participant within the Retail Cities family, one of the things that the more you spend, the more you save. We retail's in our name for a reason. And if you look at our layers of membership, Navigator, Explorer, and Voyager, there are discounts associated with both the on-site speaking engagements and the project work that we do that sits above and beyond sort of the core, very simple foundational content offer that we presented before. If you have any questions about anything that we do, please follow up with me after this webinar. All right. So now enough of the shameless self-promotion, but if you don't like that, you can ask for your money back. And now into the session itself. So when we looked at this to try to get a sort of a core look at the marketplace, I think there's a couple of important numbers here to keep in mind. Number one, though the 2023 was what we'll loosely describe as an uneven growth environment for the U.S., the U.S. Consumer spent an additional $197 billion in 2023, resulting in a growth rate of 3%. $197 billion in spending would be a material market in the world for most global companies. So that's just the growth in the U.S. And that's one of the things about the U.S. that I think is important to keep in mind as we go through this, which is almost, and we'll do this a couple of times. So, this is kind of the magician showing you the inside of their coat. But essentially, you can take any meaningful segment of the U.S. and compare it to virtually any other country in the world that isn't China, and it's usually pretty big. And I think that's one of the reasons why approaching the U.S. with a growth mindset is so important, is that especially for those of you that work for multinational businesses, niches in the U.S. are the size of basically European or Asian countries, and they can be as big as, say, your entire sub-Saharan African business. So the ability to understand the U.S. at a higher level of granularity becomes super important. When you look at this in general, obviously the top 100 retailers dominated growth in the market space, expanding by 227 billion in growth. For those of you that were really good at math, you'll note that's larger than the 197 billion in growth. And that in essence, for all of the talk about how the internet is fragmenting the world and how small and independent operators are taking over everything, the top 100 retail ecosystems in the United States captured more than 100% of all of the growth in the market, which is basically that everything outside of the top 100 shrank. Because when we look at the e-commerce numbers in particular, we've captured the GMV sales for the marketplaces, notably Amazon, as well as eBay and Walmart. But I mean, notably Amazon here from a scale point of view, and that when you look at a lot of these small businesses, their volume is concentrating under a few big umbrellas, which has the effect of, in essence, concentrating the marketplace. Growth above, and you'll hear this 5E segmentation we'll introduce in a second. Growth was above inflation was achieved by large-scale retailers in all classes of trade of those 5Es, except for expert. And expert is really where discretionary spend lives. You'll see DIY, electronics, sporting goods, furniture, home decor. All of these channels struggled in a narrative which has become pretty familiar to those of you in the U.S. market, which is that in the U.S. in 2023, essentials outperformed discretionary, and that our data backs that up 100% or more. The top 100 retailers are now 51.5% of all consumer spending. They've crossed that 50% threshold from 2022. There was some M&A activity, which was quiet, for all the talk about LeanEcon and the FTC, and we could have a whole separate webinar on the somewhat bizarre interpretation of antitrust law the FTC used to challenge the Kroger-Albertsons merger. But for all that, a lot of the growth in the top 100 was fueled by acquisition, notably in one class of trade, which was convenience. So this is one of the smallest expansions in consumer spending that we've seen You know, 2020, 19, and 17 grew in smaller amounts in total dollars than the 197 billion. You can see we're coming off of 2 years where basically $1.5 trillion of spend was added to the market. Again, $1.5 trillion in spend on its own, independent of anything else, would be a gigantic marketplace in and of itself. So that 1.6 trillion in spending is which is just basically the U.S. retail growth since COVID, is a market in and of itself. And again, this now combines both retail and food service into this number. This slow growth number, you know, sort of then allowed some retailers to use some assets and cash to make some acquisitions. So we got some pretty good movements in the top 100. Before we get into that, I just want to try to establish some of the pillars of the U.S. that kind of underpin some of this. And this is kind of what we'll loosely call some of the description of the U.S. when we often use is sort of describing it as the world's largest emerging market from a growth point of view. Number one, from an income polarization perspective, I'm assuming some of you on this call have heard me speak before. If you have, you have heard me say something like a description of the U.S. as income distribution. Not its income per capita, just way higher than some of these countries, but the distribution of that income on a per person basis looks way more like an emerging market than a quote developed one. Our income distribution looks more like Turkey than France. And I think that's for those of you not from the US, if you only remember one thing about trying to bring products and brands to life in this country, remember that. It's the single thing that European companies in particular get wrong about the US is they assume a homogeneity of purchasing power, which is just hard to imagine when you look at an affluent country. That just isn't true here. And that what you really want to think about this place is not as a larger version of France, but as Brazil with more money. And that's a more helpful frame to try to understand what some of the market opportunities are. Ethnic fragmentation, particularly when you look at the under 35 population in the United States, which is basically a 52 to 48 Caucasian and non-Caucasian split. And one of the reasons why that a narrative that is inclusive is so critical, and a narrative that varies from the rules of inclusiveness positioned by under 35s can get you quote unquote canceled in a hurry. Obviously, you run into a translation issue when you are a brand that appeals to, it's a huge demographic appeal to people over 50. And you try to have a conversation with people under 35, and you have that conversation in a way that gets back to the people over 50, you can end up getting canceled by the people over 50 or having your product shot by Kid Rock on a video. These are all interesting challenges to managing the US. Regional variance at massive scale in the United States.
Brian, we did get one comment that the audience wasn't able to see slides 5, 6, and 7. So if you could just go back and replay those.
Oh, sure, yeah. So and for those of you that are attending the session and want a copy of the slides, feel free to ping us afterwards, and we can ensure that you are slide enabled. So here is slide 5. I don't really want to go back and read it again, but certainly if somebody wants to screenshot it, knock yourself out. And here is slide 6, which basically is the waterfall chart for growth in the U.S. landscape. For slide 7, and now we're back on slide 7. Primary healthcare is a massive issue in the U.S. and one we'll continue to explore at retail cities over the next year or two, particularly as the drug class of trade in the United States is dealing with some existential challenges from a cost structure point of view. There's going to be a massive shift, I think, in the U.S. as you look at some of the opportunities that retailers have in healthcare. In this example, Dollar General here offering mobile clinics outside of its stores is an interesting way to look at that, particularly when you cross that with the income inequality issue and the challenge that low-income shoppers in the U.S. have getting access to primary healthcare. The last is regions. At Retail Cities, we did a really good report on what we call the big 3 states in the United States, which are California, Texas, and Florida. California, Texas, and Florida, ranked in order, if they were countries, would be the 6th, 11th, and 17th largest retail markets in the world. So there is so little energy sometimes spent trying to understand these types of pockets of growth in the U.S. If this were in your classification as a global company as an emerging market, you would do this as a matter of course. A lot of people don't today, and I think that, and they really leave a lot of growth opportunity on the table as a result. So when we look at the top 100, the top 100 grew by 7% in 2023 versus all retail growing at 3. However, the average top 100 U.S. retailer grew by about 12% in the 52-week trading cycle. So Starbucks is sort of the average U.S. top 100 retail. It was number 20. It's about 35 billion in sales, grew at 12%. So, and that's interesting, by the way, just in general, to think about Starbucks as an average company, given how much mind share they take up when you're thinking about excellence, particularly from a marketing point of view. But Starbucks is sort of your run-of-the-mill U.S. retailer, top 100 retailer from a performance point of view. You can break this out a little bit and sort of look at sort of cross segments and things like that. I do think it's interesting. Your top 10 grew at 5.5%, which is actually a little bit slower than the overall top 100. But it was the next 15 where you saw a lot of the energy, and that was largely consolidation, particularly in C-Store, 7-Eleven with their acquisition of Speedway, and Racetrack acquiring the Gulf Oil retail assets. And then all these, obviously, the big one in the grocery space was all these acquisition of Southeastern Grocers, and their continuing efforts to scale that business. One of the areas we follow a lot at retail cities around the world is the global value discount class of trade. So for those of you that have any questions about that, please let us know, including the mysterious reaction Wall Street had to Dollar Tree's deciding they're going to close some stores, which everybody knows they need to do. And Wall Street decided to tank their stock this morning for reasons best known to Wall Street. That's actually probably a pretty good idea. Anyway, you've got some consolidation going on in that next 15 space. And then that top 50 to 100 are where you see a lot of the fast growing players that we'll discuss a little bit later. When you look at this from a 5Es point of view, and this is now a description that we had to try to segment a little bit less by traditional box type and a little bit more by use case. So when you look at the 5Es, they are, as you can see, essentials, basic need, retailers whose shopping trips are rooted in need. And this is really mass club, grocery, C-Store. That's sort of the major factor there. Essentials grew at 8.4%. Eating out, which are food service and the quick delivery services in the food service side, grew at 8. Elegance is our third, and elegance is where we kind of put department stores, beauty, and fashion all together. We always got a little bit tired of trying to figure out where to put basically Sephora and Ulta, who are retailers that are a little bit like experts, the next class of trade that we'll talk about, but also share a competitive footprint with department stores that made it awkward to put them in that classification, right? So we wanted to put the retailers that are largely competing with each other in the same bucket. And so fashion, beauty, all retailers that lean in heavily there, as well as, so you saw that one grew relatively slowly, and a lot of that growth is coming from beauty. And obviously a lot of the contraction in that space is coming out of the department store channel from an apparel point of view. Expert, as we said, was down. By far the biggest retailers in the expert class of trade are the US DIY retailers that had a rough year from a sales growth point of view. So you're going to see, despite the fact there's a lot of things within the expert channel, Home Depot and Lowe's are by a mile the largest. So often that channel is just a reflection of how Home Depot and Lowe's are doing. And then e-commerce obviously growing at 13.7%. I do think it's interesting to note that if I had asked most people on this call how much faster e-commerce was growing than the fastest growing components of the brick and mortar retail ecosystem, the answer would not have been less than 2x as fast. And I think this is one of the factors that is so critical when you're looking at the US in particular, which is that because e-commerce is large here, the growth rate on it's going to start to slow down in a way that's going to confuse people that are trying to resource it. So the top 10 expansionists in the US looking at it, Amazon, in a shocking surprise, Amazon grew a lot. This is why you tune in. So by about 56 billion in retail and GMV, growing by more than basically the number 2, 3, and 4 put together. 2 and 4 growing largely through acquisition, which are 7-Eleven and BP. And then Walmart coming in at number 3 on that growth list. Aldi at 6, again, from an acquisition point of view, a lot of that is the Southeastern Grocers acquisition, though Aldi's also growing quite fine from an organic point of view. Racetrack acquisition-wise, CVS at number 8, a lot of that is obviously pharmacy growth. For those of you that don't sell prescriptions to CVS, seeing them as one of the top 10 growth retailers in the US will alarm you, because if this slide gets into the hands of your management team, they're going to give you way too big a number to hit. Just point out to them that that is all pharmacy growth. Number 9 is Publix. Publix is a $60 billion retailer. For those of you outside the US, you may have never heard of Publix, but they are one of the largest food retailers in the United States, and in all but about 6 countries on earth would be the largest food retailer in that market from a size point of view, and they essentially operate in one corner of the country. And then Albertsons growing at 5.4 billion, coming in at number 10. So that when we look at this, and yeah, and I think when you look at Kroger, they're not far out of the top 10 to answer the question already. And yes, we do see them continuing to drive a lot of future growth. And then obviously there's a giant open question on the table in the US about what's going to happen to Kroger and Albertsons as the FTC continues to look at that. Look, I'm no lawyer and I'm no politician, but were the FTC to not allow Kroger and Albertsons to merge would be what I might just describe as deeply ahistorical from a legal point of view. Anyway. But right now, I think it's quite difficult in the United States to predict how the FTC and how the courts are going to choose to interpret this. But let's put it this way: there's very little legal reason why Kroger and Albertsons shouldn't be allowed to combine, provided that they have a plan to divest about somewhere between 600 and 800 stores, which they do, and that would be to CNS. By the way, for those of you following this, CNS is also the wholesale partner for Southeastern Grocers, and it would not surprise us at all to see Aldi take several hundred of the stores that they've acquired that they are not going to turn into Aldi stores and then sell those to the new CNS to create a national U.S. grocery chain. So yeah, when you look at the contractionist, yeah, Home Depot and Lowe's were for two fundamental reasons. One, obviously, consumers weren't spending as much on home improvements in the United States, and two, the price of lumber came down, and that's a big driver of just total top line sales. Apple's business, for all of there's a reason why Apple's share price has been under pressure a little bit. A lot of that's China. Some of that's just Apple just didn't have a particularly good year from a product innovation point of view. So their sales from a distribution perspective were down. Electronics in general, as you can see from Best Buy, not a great year again for discretionary spend. And as you can see here, Macy's, Qurate, which are the home shopping channels in the US, QVC and HSN. Williams-Sonoma, which is cookware. eBay contracted, which is remarkable given what's happening in the third-party business. Kudos to eBay. When you're shrinking in a shrinking market, that's one thing. When you're shrinking in a market that's massively growing, that's a separate problem. And then Gap and Nordstrom. Apparel in the US also challenged this year from a discretionary spending point of view. This just gives you a feel for where spend lives in the top 100. And you can see that of the top 100, an enormous amount of the spend is occupied by essentials, and basically essentials is sort of essentials and eating out are basically 2/3. Essentials is basically half. Everything else is the other half. And then that other half sort of shifts a little bit back and forth between e-com, which can also clearly has an essentials component to it. Expert, eating out, and elegance. And this just gives you a breakdown as to what we put into each one of those quadrants. And then from an industry subgroup performance, just to try to break this down again from a C-store point of view, that 60 billion in growth added, a lot of that was growth captured by one retailer from another through acquisition. C-stores are not the largest pure organic growth channel in the United States, but that you saw the most growth captured in the United States by large C-store operators. E-com at number 2, and then mass and club from an essentials point of view at number 3, and then grocery at number 4. Grocery, mass, and club together from a dollars of growth point of view grew by more than e-commerce did, which is just a useful number to have kicking around in your head if you're trying to plan the United States from an essentials point of view in particular. I'm not the first or last person to tell you that omni-channel is going to be the key to growth in the marketplace. You can see here how we kind of how we kind of mix and match the rest. You've got the value segment. For all of the conversation about the challenges value had this year, it does continue to grow. And posted about $15 billion in total growth for the United States. So about 7.5% of all the sales added. And if you take that and add the off-price department stores, which we classify as elegant, so the TJ Maxx and Rosses of the world, you can see that value had a reasonably strong year. As you move through the rest, you can see some other things in here. Beauty specialist growing at 17.5%, and pet specialty growing at almost 17%. And then food specialist, a relatively small part of the industry, but growing at 15. All of that gets you to a point where when you can ramp up the taste level and the offer and the proposition, there's real opportunity to grow in the US, even in troubled economic times. I think that's just one of the key things that needs to be remembered here, is that a lot of the growth that you see in the United States comes from the more premium end of the market, even though the economy is under pressure. Why? That's income distribution. This is just a very simple look at some of the mistakes we see companies making from a retail market understanding point of view. And so our top 7 retail landscape mistakes. Number 1, over-focusing on growth rates. And I think this is just muscle memory for businesses in terms of how they allocate resources. The minute growth rates slow down, they start to pull resources away from a team. The challenge is, particularly in Amazon business today, Amazon's growth rate is slow, but it's now 15% of your business instead of 4%, and does need to be resourced as a more mature part of your portfolio. And I think this is going to be a real challenge, especially for businesses that are still assigning e-commerce growth targets at a board level. If you don't get Amazon right, you can't grow e-commerce fast enough. So there's no amount of anything else that can make it up. So making sure I've got the right mix of resources on the Amazon business is critical. For teams that are working on retailers, under focusing on e-commerce within the omnichannel businesses is a big mistake. It tends to not be a very big part of the volume, but it's an enormous part of the growth. And that is a very big issue as we're trying to find these pockets of growth. Not embracing fragmentation of growth, no matter who you are. Everyone in this virtual room is more important, as we say. Muscle memorying drug. I think Benjamin Franklin's definition of insanity, the great U.S. Patriot. His definition of insanity is that great quote about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something different to happen. The United States drugstore channel, and we can have a whole separate conversation about this, has a couple of existential issues. Number 1 is the economics of the pharmacy business aren't getting better. 2, the healthcare ecosystem is requiring a business like CVS, which is a little bit more integrated into a broader healthcare solution. And 3, a lot of these retailers have a deeply urban footprint, and managing urban retail in the United States right now is not easy from a shrink point of view. So you've got a bunch of conflating issues right now in drug that are causing an enormous amount of difficulty. And it is not a difficulty we expect to resolve itself particularly well in the short term. Overemphasizing value in the short term. This channel continues to grow, but what we refer to as the cash flow statement shopper, the lowest income shopper in the US, the one that's essentially living paycheck to paycheck. Though if you believe our friends at Payments, 62% of Americans, including many households that make over $200,000 a year, are in effect living from paycheck to paycheck. But these are households that have relatively low discretionary income and relatively low and no savings that are just trying to manage from pay event to pay event. Treating grocery as one thing because it's not, and ignoring Instacart because it's complicated. It's so complicated, we don't count Instacart on this list because it double counts sales from other retailers, but it's important to keep Instacart in mind. This is just a quick snapshot of the US from a top 100 point of view, just to give you a feel for the number of retailers. For those of you that are trying to manage the US in a global context, take a picture of this slide. There's no other market in the world where there are this many retailers that are material to the overall marketplace that run this many different business models. And that the diversity of business model in the United States is an absolutely critical part of how you need to manage retail growth within the context of this market space. And that when you look at the sales, the growth here, even though it is more concentrated than as you can see from the just simple store count number, you can still see that this is a market where there's enormously different business models that make up a huge chunk of how the market space works. And just looking at, the basic, even before we get into the small boxes in the bottom right quadrant, you've got 8 different boxes: Mass Club, Ecom, Grocery, DIY, QSR, C-Store, Value, and Drug, that are 75% of the market. Those formats all work really, really differently in terms of how they make money, how they operate, what their profit models are, and what their shopper missions are. So understanding the US from a channel fragmentation point of view makes it a really big piece of this. When you look at, and then when you look, of course, just at simply Mass Club, Ecom, and Grocery, those 3 formats just by themselves are $1.9 trillion and almost the second largest retail market in the world. It's almost the size of China, just those 3 formats on their own. We break it down a little bit. When you look at we'll take a look at a quick snapshot look at each one of the 5 E's, if you will. So from an essentials point of view, looking at the retailers adding sales here, 3 of them through acquisition: 7-Eleven, BP, and Aldi. Added together about $46 billion through acquisition. Walmart growing at about $23 billion from an organic point of view, and Costco continuing to be one of the foundational growth stories in global retail. Is Costco's business in the United States. Costco's business around the world also continues to grow quite quickly, to a degree where Costco is very quietly the 3rd largest retailer on earth. And no one knows that. So, but Costco continuing to be the 3rd largest retailer in the US as well, and continuing to post remarkably strong growth numbers as you look at their business. The one implication for Costco is if the Kroger-Albertsons merger does go through, and Costco, for the first time in a while, faces a competitor in Kroger in the Western United States that's a little bit more aggressive on price, that might be the first thing to come along to disrupt Costco's business in a long time. Costco's been running a very strong value proposition versus basically the Safeway division of Albertsons for a fairly long time, and has been basically growing grocery market share west of the Rockies in the United States, and has been doing so for a generation. When you look at these, the essentials, 8.4% growth rate. They're 58% of the top 100 and 68% of the top 100's total growth. Breaking it down and now looking at the eating out section, in here, you've got a few different key things here, where you've got Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, RBI, and then Darden rounding out the top 5. Shout out to Panda Express for entering the top 100. Strong 11% growth rate. If you like fake Chinese food, there's no place better. And that when you look at all this, you can still see that Starbucks from a sales added point of view continues to grow pretty quickly. For those of you for those of you staring at this chart, yes, we did spell Chick-fil-A incorrectly, as I've just realized now. And for a chain that is not open on Sundays, still posting an enormous amount of growth in the world. When we look at elegance here, you very quickly see an interesting mix. Because when you look at the specialists, Ulta would be right outside of this, by the way. They're just they would be number 6. So when you look at this mix, you've got the TJX businesses, TJ Maxx, and Marshalls predominantly, as well as Home Goods and HomeSense, all together from an off-price point of view, adding about $2.6 billion, and then Sephora adding $2 billion. Sephora, to some degree, is one of the most interesting retailers in the US right now. For anybody that is interested in mall-based retail, feel free to reach out to us for a follow-up conversation. The presence of Sephora in a mall is one of the most predictive things you can have to figure out whether the stores in that mall are going to do well or not. It's interesting. Malls in the United States used to have department stores as traffic drivers and other stores to make money. Today, the traffic driver to a mall in the United States is one of 2 stores. It's a Sephora or an Apple store. That's it. And then everything else kind of hangs off that. So the anchor stores of malls in the United States have moved from being Macy's and JCPenney and Sears to basically being Sephora and Apple. And if you look at the malls that have a Sephora and an Apple in them, they dramatically outperform every other mall in the country. So anyway, just some things to think about as you look at this class of trade here, growing at 3.7%. Again, because department stores are such a big part of this, and department stores in the US are both have a temporary issue from a discretionary spending point of view and a structural issue. Our conventional department stores are contracting. Burlington and Ross are two more off-price retailers, and then Lululemon comes into the mix there at number 3. From an expert point of view, again, this is you've got some interesting players in this mix here. Notably, a couple of the automotive specials, Discount Tire and O'Reilly. There's some straight up concentration going in this class of trade, not through acquisition, just through outperformance, particularly of the traditional trade, so to speak, where especially in the auto parts and tire business, where scale and buying advantage are starting to get some of these businesses to a better pricing platform. And the only reason I dwell on this a little bit is for a couple of reasons. Number one, O'Reilly's a really good example of a business that has both a B2C component to it, but also a very strong B2B component. And that's one of the things that in the US makes the US a little bit different than other markets in the world. A lot of the retailers here run a lot of business to business content, a lot of business to business commerce as well as business to consumer. And that's got dramatic impact on, for those of you that play in both spaces, around how you would think about pack price, never say this, pack price architecture, and product launch strategy within the US, because the channels here are just way blurrier. So a lot of times businesses that have a global point of view will bring a B2B launch to the US and find that it just doesn't do what they thought it would do. And that's because of the blurriness between the B2B and B2C channel here, which again, is a little bit more typical of an emerging market than a more quote unquote mature one. Do we have insights into where traffic is growing is a good question. Not in this data, no. On a case-by-case basis, yes. And but certainly we don't have a systematic asset that tracks shopper traffic around the world that say another data provider might. So that's a good question though, and I appreciate the question. I think in general, a lot of the growth that you saw in all of this, and probably should have just headlined this at the start. A lot of the growth that you're seeing in the U.S. when you look at this number, a lot of this is inflation. So a lot of the sales growth numbers, particularly in the essential side, are coming from prices rather than increases in trips. E-com, you can see here, Amazon coming in, and then you've got, and then basically when you look at this, you've really got, for all of the talk about how e-commerce is growing in the U.S. and how businesses like Shein and eventually Temu or Temu, however that thing is pronounced. I can't believe I can't remember the pronunciation of that, given how many times that song was sung during the Super Bowl. But for all that talk, a lot of the growth in e-commerce is really concentrated in one platform and has been in the U.S. for a very long time. There is no class of trade globally in the world that is as growth concentrated as the US e-commerce class of trade is in Amazon. And yes, the omnichannel retailers are doing better. Yes, Walmart is a very strong proposition and narrative. And no, the Walmart number is not captured in here because it's part of Mass and Club. But for all that, Amazon continues to be the dominant player from an e-commerce point of view within the market space. So you've got some of that as well. Just to try to understand a little bit thematically, excuse me, where we see the market going. There's sort of a few important concepts that we'd like to leave you with before we check out of here and go, moving beyond the data a little bit. I think there's some interesting things that when you look at the future of stores right now, that are going to be big topics of conversation in order to try to grow within the U.S. over the next few years. Number one is just sort of the what's in store from a retail media point of view. Here are the classic example or the cooler screens executions that you can see in a range of stores like Walgreens and Kroger, where the freezer doors themselves have turned into media placement. And then a lot of, and then there's, and in essence, when that media is off, you can basically see the planogram for the frozen section on the door itself. You see more and more conversation over the next year or two about the role that media is going to play in the store, and that from an account planning point of view, that's going to make planning brick and mortar customers more complex because you're going to have a media component to that commercial relationship as well as just a simple trading one. WOW right now is a concept that we launched, used a couple of different times. Most recently when I was at Omnicom, and we did our global shopper research survey. and looked at what shoppers were expecting from shopping trips in general across different classes of trade, food service, e-commerce, brick and mortar, and kind of simplified it to three very simple words, which are wow, right, and now. And so often, as you see from the dominance of essentials that we talked about today, in terms of volume and in terms of share of overall growth, so much of the talk about the future of the store is rooted in trying to make the store, quote unquote, more experiential. Cool, let's do that. But let's not lose sight of the fact that wow is only one of the three words in wow, right, and now. And that often what the store is really there for is to help the shopper find what they're looking for quickly and efficiently, and to get what they want fast. And I think that in general, there's going to be a fair amount of innovation aimed at the wow side of wow right now, and probably a little bit less on the right and now side, but the right and now side might be more important. Three, and this is a really interesting innovation that comes out of Carrefour, actually, in Belgium, which is what they call their buy, B-U-Y, buy, B-Y-E format. And this is basically putting the now and wow right now. Which is basically a store, which is not really a store as much as it is a collection of vending machines. If half of all of the urban consumables retail in the United States doesn't look like this by 2030, I'll be stunned. The economics of urban retail right now simply don't support a labor model that can prevent the store from getting stuff stolen. Some of this is changes in hourly rates for employees. Some of that's minimum wage law. Some of that's just marketplace pressure. But in general, right now, stores can't afford to guard their products anymore. And as a result, they're all getting stolen. And oversimplification of the year. At some point, a store in an urban environment is going to have to do something to manage loss prevention in a radically different way, or Amazon is going to take over urban retail because it's way easier to guard an Amazon fulfillment center than it is to guard a store. So this type of innovation that Carrefour is running, I think something like this is really worth keeping an eye on. Just walk out technology, which is highlighted in the thing above, makes no sense in urban retail in the United States because everybody's already just walking out. You don't need more of that. So just an interesting thing to keep in mind. Number four, walk stream analysis. And look, there's a bunch of companies that do this stuff. Retail Next, my friends at Walkbase from StrataCash, Vendy. There's a bunch of businesses that have neat ways for measuring in-store traffic, but you're going to be able to granularly assess in-store traffic in the US, basically the way you can assess digital traffic. And you're basically going to be able to do, instead of clickstream analysis, walk stream analysis on how people are journeying through the store. The last one is what we call the store as a distribution center. Today, literally 5% of all of the trips to an American Essential store are somebody shopping for somebody else. Some of that is the store's own employees. Some of that is Instacart. By 2030, that number should triple if the retailers don't do something to move this type of shopping out of the retail environment and somewhere else, like a back room. About one shopping trip in 6 in the United States in 2030 is forecasted to be an individual shopping for another individual. That's got very interesting implications for how this looks. There's a good question here about how much growth is coming from urban versus suburban versus rural. We did not break that down in this presentation word I'm looking for, but we do have some supporting data, so please follow up with us afterwards to address that question. When you look at some of the retailers that are managing large numbers of have joined the 30 billion club or are getting close. So you've got Instacart in here at about 28. You've got eBay at 35, but they've been there for a while. You've got DoorDash at 30, Uber Eats at 30, and Shein at 30. So all of these are kind of now playing in the space. And now, so in essence, if you add it up, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Instacart at about $90 billion, that's a sizable enough class of trade in the eating out and essentials business that it's really worth having a channel strategy engineered at. And then as you can see here on the right, we've got estimates on traffic here from a digital point of view. I think you're going to see an enormous amount of energy in the U.S. focused on promotions over the course of 2024. For those of you that are in this market, that's not a tremendous surprise. For those of you old enough to remember the Rolling Stones, "Promotional Rescue" would be my second favorite Rolling Stones album. The retailers and brands are all looking towards promotional intensity as a way to try to recapture past glory from a growth point of view. This now gets you into environments like drug, where you're seeing an enormous amount of promotional intensity. One of the great virtues of the 2020 to 2023 planning environment is it got us out of a lot of promotions we were running that may or may not have made strategic sense. Right now, my fear is in 2024, we are muscle memorying our way back into an over-promoted retail ecosystem. So that from a planning point of view, it becomes really important to balance this. The last theme that we'll hit on before we open up for more questions is this notion of what I like to call cracked category management. Shout out to the great Canadian singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think that if you look at the US market space over the last 20 years before COVID, good, better, best is a well-understood merchandising tiering model. And to be honest, the relationship between good, better, and best in the US market space was reasonably well understood. And that reasonably well understood was, even without doing a lot of highly complex mathematical elasticity work, there hadn't been a ton of inflation in categories. And unless the category had been severely disrupted by an innovation, the price relationship between good, better, and best was pretty well understood by the retailers, by the brands themselves, and by shoppers. Obviously, the 3 years of goofball out of stocks and inflation have changed that and have created what we'll call cracks in the category, sometimes between good and better, sometimes between better and best. And what it's done is it's created white space from a price pack architecture point of view and also from a promotion point of view. This now also gets at, by the way, the answer to the question asked by an attendee about what a more intelligent, comprehensive promotional strategy looks like. This is one of my favorite examples from our friends at Upfield. I just think this is a really clever way to think about promotional strategy. So Violife, for those of you not familiar with that brand, is a plant-based cream cheese. So one imagines that somewhere in America, there is a household with a 15-year-old that has gone vegan, who now no longer wants to eat regular cream cheese, but is telling their parents to go buy vegan cream cheese instead. The perception on that is like, well, I don't want to effing do that. It's expensive. So now what do I do? Well, in Violife, what I do is I figure out, okay, cool. I've got a pack that's a little bit smaller from a per ounce basis than the brand leader in the category here, which is Kraft Philadelphia cream cheese. So what I'm going to take my slightly smaller pack at 7 ounces, but I'm going to now promotionally price this to encourage trial from the good product to something quote unquote better. And I can use this promotional price as a way to encourage trial because I've now priced this on Walmart.com and in Walmart at exactly basically the same price as the everyday brand leader SKU. So now what I can do is I can find shoppers who were curious about the brand, but nervous about the price point, encourage them to try. They bring it home. 15-year-old daughter finally eats something. Everybody's excited. And when it goes back up to the regular price, you're locked in. Promotion, basically, the question asked by the audience is a great one. What a more intelligent, comprehensive promotional strategy looks like, it's second word strategy. Less promotion, more strategy. What are we trying to accomplish, particularly within the context of how has the category changed over the last 3 years in terms of price pack architecture and the relationship between good, better, and best? What are the opportunities I have to promote to capture shoppers from a brand whose price value relationship's changed, or enter white space in the category that's been created by prices going up unevenly? How do I think about promotions as a way that, how do I think about them more as a customer acquisition strategy and less as a volume strategy, specifically now when shopper habits have been inverted a little bit because their traditional price relationships between good, better, and best have changed, and their purchasing power is under pressure. So thinking about what promotions do within the context of that becomes really powerful. So to wrap up our little presentation today, one, from a top 100, look, when you look at the top 100, a lot of the retailers that we talked about today are either retailers that are focused on specific need states or have the data to dive into specific need states to get after what we'll call the pole position and the growing in a polarized market. You've got niches in the US that are the size of European countries. Cities, unique consumers, and route to market. Just one throwaway stat that we don't have in here, but if you take the 7 cities in the United States that have a population density, excuse me, of over 10,000 people per square mile, and sorry to make the Europeans' head hurt. That's kind of 1,000 people per square kilometer. So 1,000 people per 10,000 people per square mile. Those 7 cities in the United States, if you just added them up, that's the 3rd largest retail market on earth. And at $5.5 trillion of GDP, it's a massive economy. The great thing about those cities, which are New York, I always forget the 7 of them, but it's New York, Washington, Boston, Miami, LA, Chicago, and San Fran, I think. Those 7 cities, if you're a US commercial manager, you're not real sure what your market share is in any of those. It's Washington, DC instead of LA. So those 7 cities have highly fragmented and unusual retail ecosystems that are all different from each other and different from the rest of the country. And again, in some ways, look a lot more like an emerging market. Any of you that have ever dealt with a wholesaler in a part of an emerging market that's got a complete monopoly share on how that market works will understand trying to sell products in New York City, which is kind of the same thing. So the management of that, I think, is really interesting. But for all the talk about the deurbanization of the U.S., the statistics on that just don't hold up. And that there was a very small deurbanization in the U.S. in general. There are some cities, notably San Francisco, that have seen a more significant migration. But for the most part, the U.S. is reurbanizing now, basically, as companies are making people go back to work. The U.S. is predictably reurbanizing. And that urban is probably, of the 3, urban, suburban, and rural, probably the least well understood and largest pocket of growth opportunity. Channel fragmentation. We talked about this a lot throughout the course of the presentation. The 5 E's, look, essentials drove more than e-commerce did, though a lot of e-commerce growth is in essential products. So understanding how to get the foundational need states right becomes really important. Retail media network powered retailers on their own represent more than 100% of retail growth as well. This notion of double jointed planning, shout out to anybody that came to our double jointed planning event in November, where we discussed the need to sort of integrate a media business plan and a commercial business plan. This is going to become a critical skill. Promotional rescue, let's not go back to where we were, and this crack category management concept and letting the light in. So that today is what we've got. For any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Brian.Gildenberg@retailcities.com, Desiree Fung, who's our global marketing director, Desiree.Fung@retailcities.com, and then Mark Bird from Retail Cities, who's in addition to one of our faces of the clients here is also doing some very interesting work that Mark's leading in the convenience store space. So if you have more questions about the C-store channel, please follow up with Mark directly as well. And then Ray, if anybody has any questions that we can't answer, please ask Ray. So this concludes the formal part of our presentation. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. If you have any questions, now's a pretty good time to fire away. The chat.
Brian, I'll give you one question.
Certainly, Ray.
So as you think about the anniversary of a strong growth rate, it's obviously harder and harder to repeat. Are there any high performers in this year where you think they're going to struggle to repeat again next year?
I think certainly, obviously, the ones that grew through acquisition are probably not going to make. I mean, unless they make another major acquisition, that's all fairly random. I do think that 2024 is going to see a rebalancing of spend, particularly in the back half of the year, probably more into the discretionary channels. So I think you're going to see, I think in general, when you look at the essentials retailers, you'll note a couple of things from them. Number one, inflation has slowed down, so their overall growth rates are going to be very difficult to maintain. And then number two, I do think you'll start to see spend shift back a little bit out of essentials into other things. So that I would say that any of the retailers that are from an essentials point of view that aren't Walmart may struggle from a growth point of view. Target's an interesting one because Target, though we have them classified as an essentials retailer, they may start to get more growth back out of their non-essentials part of their business. And that, so you may see them actually resume a little bit of growth as well. Home Depot and Lowe's have both forecasted that their comps will turn positive instead of negative. And again, a lot of that is lumber pricing, so that'll pick up as well. But I think in general, where you're probably going to see a little bit of growth slowdown might be in sort of the middle of the pack. With essentials retailers that were largely growing because of inflation, because inflation in the U.S. is moderating. There's a question from an attendee, crack category management. Basically what that means is that inflation changed the pricing relationships between good, better, and best in a lot of categories, creating what we describe as cracks between those tiers in a way that might invite a product innovation or a pricing strategy to capture unmet consumer demand where the price of one thing went up by more than the price of another. So that if the price of the good option in a category went up by more than the price of the better, there might be an opportunity for a more value-centric brand to come in and capture share on the good side. Where we often see it most commonly is that the relationship between better and best has changed. And it's created a lot of opportunity at the top end of the market because better has gone up in price, relatively speaking, more than best did. And that the premium brands today have less of a price premium attached to them in a post-inflationary world than a pre-inflationary world. And through smart pricing can capture shoppers through trial and then convert them because the product is not historically as much more as expensive as it used to be. And that's where we've seen a lot of growth in the marketplace. If you talk to a lot of brands in the US, they're seeing a lot of growth coming at the premium end of the category, sometimes through intelligent pricing, like the Upfield example that we showed. The ability to use promotions as a way to capture shoppers and then convert them back when the price gap isn't as big as it used to be. All right, we are very close to the top of the hour anyway, and we appear to have no more questions from the audience. So on behalf of Retail Cities, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in today. And again, if you have any questions about anything we're doing here at Retail Cities, if you want us to come and present a point of view on the marketplace to a virtual or live audience, or you want more information on our syndicated content, or you think there's a problem you think we can help with, give us a buzz and let us know. Look forward to talking to all of you at some point, and thank you all very much for attending. Have a good session. Have a good rest of your day.